Thank you all, and thank you for the kind introductions and for arranging these talks. It's a great opportunity for students and faculty to exchange ideas and think about what they can do with the tools that we're working on in classes. And you said, hey, we can get our noodles going, right? For hopefully from this talk. I also kind of hope that this talk gets your feet going too. Not necessarily if you want to dance, that's fine, but actually not just thinking but doing things. So my name of my talk is "The Point is to Change and Interpret It: Grassroots Organizing as an Experimental Method," and I'll get into what that title refers to in a moment. But I want to just start by saying thanks to the University Diversity Committee and to the folks behind Yodi Talks. I want to especially thank Jeremy for doing the legwork and kind of putting all this together and working with a lot of kind of promotions and video production folks, and it's really, I appreciate it. I also want to thank some folks that I took classes with at Penn State who are really central to some of the ideas we'll talk about in a moment. Two professors who have both unfortunately passed away in the last few years. One, his name is Ron Bettig, and his wife Jeannie Lynn Hall. And both of them were folks who kind of introduced me to and helped me understand this process of culture jamming, which we'll talk about in a moment. So I'm thanking them as well. So I want to just kind of refer back to this title and this image. The image on the person on the left is obviously Abraham Lincoln. Anybody know where this part of the quote comes from here? Have you seen that before? So this is a quote adapted from Karl Marx. All right, you might have heard his name. All right, and Karl Marx, we've probably all got kind of perceptions and maybe some misperceptions of who he was and what he did. You probably heard of Capital and the Communist Manifesto as his two big works. And I think for much of the public, he's associated with socialism and communism, these sorts of ideas. Among kind of researchers and academics, he's more kind of associated with scientific inquiry. He's kind of somebody who's thought of as a big thinker in philosophy, in social sciences, in economics. Doesn't mean that you need to agree with him. A lot of folks, don't agree with him, either his, social policy that he was encouraging, or his academic work. But it's stuff that people in communication studies, economics, philosophy, et cetera, everybody, if you're an academic in the area, you have to engage with his ideas. You have to try and figure out where you stand in relation to his stuff. So when I think about my talk and how it relates to some of his ideas, this is an image from the Humboldt University in Berlin. And the quote at the top of the stairs, I believe it's in their social sciences department. It says, "Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." All right. So Marx, as a philosopher, was saying, "Hey, I don't think people have necessarily taken the ideas that they've been developing and used them to change the world." And he thought that the process of people engaging in world-changing activities was what helps make sense of the history of the world. And at the same time, I look at the quote and I'm like, there's something really vague about it. There's something that isn't quite clear about it. I can't figure out when I'm looking at it, is Marx saying that philosophers should actually be the ones trying to change the world? I don't know. I think you can, with any good quote, there's kind of a little bit left to interpretation where people can read it in different ways, right? I can look at it and say, maybe he was saying that people should, theorize, philosophize, all right? And then those ideas should help inform people's activities who try to change the world. Which kind of makes sense when you think of Marx. He writes Capital first, which is his economic and political analysis. And then from capital, based on that kind of much more scientific work that he does, he goes and he turns and says, based on what I've studied here, my analysis of how capitalism works, here's what I think people should do about it. And his next book with Engels is called The Communist Manifesto, right? So he's got, you can kind of see this quote reflected in what he ends up producing over his lifetime. But when I look at it, I'm also kind of sitting there wondering, well, was he maybe suggesting that it shouldn't be just philosophers, developing theories and ideas, in his perspective, critical ideas that put power at the center of the analysis, and then encouraging other people to act with it? But is he suggesting that actually those philosophers should be involved in some of that world-changing activity? And Marx was involved in actual trade union organizing, so it's not to say that he was, completely separate from the things he was writing about and proposing. Right? So it's kind of this question of what's the relationship between the thinker and the doer. And these are not completely new ideas by any means. And I think anyone who sits there and writes a dissertation, for instance, that kind of culminating work at the end of your PhD, you sit there and you say, it would be really nice if this didn't just sit on a library shelf and have 5 readers over the next X number of years. And no offense to library shelves, all right? But it would be really nice if this had an impact, if this did something, right? And so this is kind of a question that I think a lot of folks who feel like they're doing meaningful work are kind of thinking through and saying, how can the work that I do, the thinking that I do, hopefully make the world a little bit better place. When I look at it, if there's the potential for ideas to change the world, might we also kind of flip it around? Might the activities that we do to change the world also help us understand it? All right, and I'm going to be talking about that relationship. All right, might our organizing, might our activism, if you're in applied research, maybe sales, maybe growing your business, maybe growing your university, maybe those are activities that you engage in, and when you engage in them, maybe you learn something from it too. All right, so there might be kind of a reverse way of looking at this as well. When I think about it that way, then Marx might be suggesting experiments, right? This is the Google search result when you search for experiment, all right? Notice anything? What do the experimenters look like? Well, it clearly is angled for some reason for kids. I don't know if it's because I'm also looking up kids' videos because I've got a 21-month-old, but what's the scientist look like? They look like a scientist, right? White lab coat, all right, beakers and all that stuff. And so we've got this kind of view of experiments as this thing that people do in kind of the natural sciences and chemistry and biology and these sorts of areas. When I'm looking at it, it doesn't seem to lend itself to kind of social scientific research. And again, this is just a Google image search, right? But it also doesn't lend itself to the kind of experiments that I'm going to be talking about in a little bit either. In communication studies, we tend to get, my field, we tend to have experiments that fall into one of 3 groups. So we have experiments that are done in labs. Right, and this is true in communication studies, but also in psychology, sociology, et cetera, and in other social sciences. We have experiments that are done in labs where a person will look at a screen, and maybe the Facebook profile has a person in the profile picture where they're smiling, and maybe in other profile pictures they're not smiling. Right, and that's the only variable that changes, and as a result, you can test what the effect is of having a smiling profile picture versus a not smiling profile picture across a wide range of people who come into a lab and look at that screen. Right? These are laboratory experiments, and when you kind of take a basic research methods class, this is what we tend to focus on in terms of experiments. Right? Some of you have taken my basic research methods class, and this is what we talked about. Right? This is another form of experiment. It's called a field experiment. This is an image from a public service announcement by, I can't remember what the exact organization was, but it was an organization that was working to stop, or to encourage people to stop smoking. all right? And they basically had two forms of this PSA. One form of the PSA, everything else was exactly the same, but the message was, if you smoke, you're going to die, all right? The other form of the PSA was, if you smoke, you are going to die eventually, because we all do, all right? But at the end of your life, or at some point in your life, you might have some really terrible medical conditions that you have to work through in those years after you've smoked, or maybe while you're still smoking. Anybody have any idea which ad might have worked better? What public service announcement might have encouraged folks to, think about quitting smoking? The health issue. Yeah, because people say to themselves, well, I'm going to die, all right? All of us are, but I would prefer not to have some of these health conditions that these people were talking about in the ad. This is a field experiment because these ads actually went out. They're consumed by people in their real-life settings, and they're not in a laboratory. So as a result, you can't control for all variables, but you've got an opportunity to see how ads really affect people in their real-life viewing situations. This is called a field experiment. One of the most famous communication studies experiments was it's called a natural experiment. It's just kind of an experiment that happens by chance. This is a image of Orson Welles, who produced The War of the Worlds, and the War of the Worlds broadcast kind of produced this really amazing experimental opportunity where some people had heard War of the Worlds and some people had not, right? And it was supposed to be it was a drama, but apparently some folks thought it was real. We're finding out now that not quite as many folks thought it was real as we thought in the late 1930s, right? But it created this sort of natural experimental condition where if they sent surveys out to folks, you could have people who responded who had heard it, folks who had not, and you could gauge their level of panic or fear, et cetera, right? Now, all of these kind of experimental methods in communication studies, they all have control as a key element. When you're doing an experiment, you want to try to control for exposure to certain variables. In a laboratory experiment, the ideal part of a lab experiment is that you can just change one variable and see what the effect of changing that one variable is, that smile in the profile picture, for instance, and how that affects people's perceptions of the person that is, extending a friend invite, for instance. Right? So there's a desire to control exposure to the treatment variable or to other potentially confounding variables and keep those confounding variables out of the experiment. There's also the use of control groups. Right? So groups that are not exposed to the treatment, not exposed to the variable that you think might influence people's behavior or attitudes or knowledge. Okay? So when we do a laboratory experiment like this, we're going to have a group that gets the smile, a group that doesn't get the smile, and a third group that just doesn't even look at the page at all. All right? And then we can figure out whether there's some sort of special experience that has happened to folks that looked at the screen in the first place. Right? So we have this desire to produce control groups, some groups that get the treatment, some groups that don't get the treatment, et cetera. Lastly, I like to think of, and usually these are the two that are talked about in textbooks. The third is that these experiments are designed to figure out how to control populations. Right? Now, I don't mean that in a kind of, puppeteer kind of way where we've got people doing experiments that are geared toward manipulating people. But if you do an experiment, one thing you find out is how people react to different stimuli. All right? So one outcome of experiments is that you learn how, as an institution, to more effectively change people's behaviors. Right? They're geared toward control. Right? So there's control of exposure, control groups, and control of populations that come out of this. Now, for someone like me who studies organizations, big media companies, right, and institutions such as the democratic process, such as advertising that supports these companies, it's hard to figure out how you would test some of your theories experimentally. All right? How do you set up an experiment that figures out what the working variables are in the Walt Disney Company? All right? I can't go and tell the Disney Company, all right, this half of the companies, you're all going to operate now under a worker-owned collective, right? You're no longer going to be owned by shareholders with a profit motive, and then we're going to have these companies who are going to continue operating as they are. We'll see, what sort of resulting content you each end up producing. All right, I can't. I don't have that level of control, obviously, over these organizations, even though that would be the best predictive way to figure out how these different variables might influence television content or movie content, et cetera. Right? And even when we're not talking about organizations, when we're talking about the distribution of wealth in society or the impact of money on politics, figuring out how you would design experiments is kind of mind-bending. It's mind-bending enough that they don't even talk about these sorts of experimental options in your textbook about experiments. All right? But at the end of the day, experiments are, according to Wikipedia, even young children perform rudimentary experiments to learn about the world and how things work, all right? Which is basically the idea that we do things and we see what happens. And then in doing those things and seeing what happens, we learn about the world, all right? So what I'd like to think about is, are there some options for conducting experiments that help us understand these sorts of institutions? Big media organizations are sort of organizations that I'm interested in. I'm interested in their relationship to wealth. I'm interested in their relationship to democracy. How can we devise some experiments that help understand how power operates in those contexts? We do have some good examples of people who have tried some of this stuff. We have, for instance, Independent Media Center, which is kind of a collective, a journalist co-op of journalists who basically started working together to create a nonprofit, collectively owned structure for producing news. And boy, did they produce different news than we usually get from commercial for-profit media organizations. It's an experiment, though. It's trying something new and seeing what happens. Magnet is a group of activists and academics who work to produce also a more democratic media system. These are, groups that. This one is not quite as, this was more active in the 1990s. Magnet is more visible today. Free Press was some of you, if you've taken my or other folks' media studies classes, you might have read some stuff by Bob McChesney, who's kind of a big thinker in critical media studies. He went and started this organization with some of his colleagues called Free Press, which was designed to try to influence the media policy making process. They saw problems with media policy and they said, let's create an organization based on what we've learned that can go out and try to change the media landscape through policy, through reform. And as a result, they've learned a lot about how media policy and media reform works. And you tend to do that when you're trying to make it happen yourself, right? Larry Lessig, he's a academic from, he studies copyright and law, and he's run for president now twice, I believe, and he's run for president on the platform of, I'm going to focus exclusively on campaign finance reform, and after I get elected, I will resign from office after I get campaign finance reform passed that goes ahead and takes money out of politics. It's an interesting platform, all right? But it's an experiment. It's him taking his academic background and saying, maybe I could change things by getting active in the media and policy landscape. I want to watch a quick video here. This is a video from the Rachel Maddow show, and this is kind of where I see myself getting involved in some experimental work right now around organizing, around activism, that I'm trying to learn from by getting engaged in.
And we had about how many news organizations covering this event?
3. We had cameras from TV. We had newspapers. Our media release went out an hour before our event. There is a lot of interest in covering this kind of groundswell organizing.
So great job today. Effective?
Yeah. Read Indivisible. It really works.
Read Indivisible. It really works. What is Indivisible? This is Indivisible. This is kind of, I think, it's kind of the secret sauce that explains what is bubbling up as what may be the start of the anti-Trump movement. It's called Indivisible, and you should know this is out there, because if there is going to be an anti-Trump movement in this country, particularly one akin to the kind of anti-Obama movement that afflicted the last presidency at the outset of their time in Washington, if there is going to be an anti-Trump movement, I think right now this is going to explain a lot about what its early stages looked like over these next couple of weeks. This started as an online Google document last month. It has now evolved into this slim little 25-page organizing guide. It's not a complicated thing. It was written, interestingly, by former congressional staffers, basically advising people all around the country who are anti-Trump for whatever reason that they should learn from the tactical success of the Tea Party as they went up against Barack Obama. I'm going to quote from the guide here. The authors of this guide are former congressional staffers who witnessed the rise of the Tea Party. We saw these activists take on a popular president with a mandate for change and a supermajority in Congress. We saw them organize locally and convince their own members of Congress to reject President Obama's agenda. Their ideas were wrong, cruel, and tinged with racism, and they won. So the reason I'm talking about this tonight, the reason we're going to talk about one of the authors of this guide in just a moment, is because this has not really been cooking openly, right? In the Beltway media and on cable TV news and on places we usually look for news about politics. It has really been cooking online where it has taken off. It has already led to hundreds of local groups being sort of registered online around this idea and springing up all over the country. I think that's in part because this is very practical. It makes the whole idea very easy. There's, for example, this is a sample call script for what you should say, how you should expect it to go when you call the office of your member of Congress to complain about something. I mean, there's very, very practical information. Should I bring a sign to my member of Congress's town hall event? Should I bring a sign? Answer. It's kind of a blunt answer. Signs can be useful for reinforcing the sense of broad agreement with your message. However, if you are holding an oppositional sign, staffers will almost certainly not give you the chance to get the mic and ask a question. Right. And then this, if you have enough people to both ask questions and hold signs, though, you should go for it. Or this, a practical question. Help, my members of Congress are actually pretty good. The answer to that is, in part, congratulations, but also this. Do not switch to targeting other members of Congress who don't represent you. They don't represent you, and they don't care what you have to say. Did I mention this is written by former congressional staffers who know of what they speak, who know how members of Congress react to all sorts of various stimuli? We're going to know a lot over the next couple of weeks about whether or not there is going to be a big anti-Trump movement in this country. It started almost immediately against Barack Obama in 2009. It started way sooner than you remember. It started within a couple weeks of him being inaugurated. Part of the reason why, if the anti-Trump movement does emerge, part of the reason why will be the Democratic Party's determination to try to stop what Trump says he wants to do in Washington. And you see that in different ways around the country. You see that, for example, in the Democrat-dominated state of California, with them hiring former Attorney General Eric Holder today to advise them on their legal strategy as a state against the Trump administration today. That will be part of the anti-Trump movement. You'll see it in Washington, like with what Chuck Schumer told us last night on this show about the Democrats in the Senate and their determination to hold that Supreme Court seat open if they have to and if they can, and to slow down the confirmation process for the cabinet appointments if they have to and if they can. So you still see these things in government, and you'll see these things with elected officials and legislatures and legislators in Washington. But the more invisible and bigger force already out there, which really already does look like the start of an anti-Trump movement, is regular people already starting this organizing themselves. More ahead.
So I saw this. A lot of people kind of shared this clip and went on the Google, right? And they searched for indivisibleguide.com, and you find the PDF version of what she's holding there in her hand. And I kind of sat there and said, well, this seems to make sense to me in terms of my understanding of the political process. But I was also sitting there saying, we can get into this, and it could be kind of fun and interesting from a media perspective too. And so I've been, I worked with some folks to start one of these groups, which I'll talk about. But experimentally, I was thinking, how can we kind of use media to try to shape this political set of events that we're involved in conjunction with these tools. That's kind of how I was thinking about things experimentally here. Our particular congressional district, I live in the mountains behind here, behind campus, and behind campus and all the way up to Mammoth Lakes, all the way east to the Nevada border, and all the way west to as far as Mount Baldy, as the 8th District of California. You'll notice it's a really big district, right? And it's a really big district because of this process called gerrymandering, all right, which in many states, it's a process that creates a situation where there are only a handful of Democrats that are elected, and then Republicans sweep up the rest of the districts. In California, it's the opposite. Democrats have done a nice job sweeping every Republican on the eastern side of the state into this big district called District 8 that goes, it's red, all right? It's a red district that this guy on the right-hand side, Paul Cook, is our congressman, our representative from. Congressman Cook is, he's a veteran. He's very focused on veterans issues, is also, in terms of policy-wise, very focused on repealing the Affordable Care Act. Those are kind of his big, twin policy issues that he highlights. All right, and I say this because shortly after I saw that video, I started trying to connect with folks up in our community, the mountain communities, and I created a meetup page or a meetup event, and just kind of put it out and tried to see who would show up, who wanted to get together and start to try to implement these indivisible tactics that Rachel introduced. Right? This guy here in the back, his name is Glenn Thompson. He came here today. Good to see you, Glenn. Yeah. And a few other folks. Not a big crowd, right? We're in kind of a conservative. I mean, it's a conservative district, but we're also in a conservative area up there in the mountains. But these were folks that showed up to our little organizing meeting, and we founded a group called Indivisible San Bernardino Mountains. Right? We also realized pretty quickly that we were not going to be able to organize the 9 of us, the entire 8th district. So we went ahead and we said, this guy in the back corner here, his name's Bill. He was from Hesperia. He drove up for the day, and we said, well, Bill, why don't you go down to Hesperia and start your own group down there? Connect with people. You don't want to be driving all the way up to the mountains every time you want to meet with us, right? So as a result, we've had, through this sort of branching out process, the 8th district, we have 8 indivisible groups now that have formed. Our group in the San Bernardino Mountains, there's a group in the Victor Valley, there's a group in the Morongo Basin, Mount Baldy, Eastern Sierras, Yucaipa. Who am I leaving out, Glenn? I feel like I'm leaving somebody out. Yeah, that's the Eastern Sierras group. So it'll if I'm forgetting somebody, it'll come to me eventually. Yeah. What's that? Not exactly sure where they're falling in, but we got 8 groups. All right, they've kind of self-organized around the district. And when I was coming at this from a communication studies perspective and thinking about, well, how would we actually set up our group and make it work, I started thinking back to some of my kind of media and communication stuff that we talk about in class. And one of the big lessons that I try to emphasize for students, both historically with relationship to media, but also especially contemporarily with social media, is that media are plural, all right? There are many media. We oftentimes hear the word the media, but clearly there are lots of different types of media, and in social media we see that there are lots of different options for people to communicate, organize, share, etc. And I like to think, since we've got this plural form of media, all these different options, I like to really think of them as tools, and each of those tools has different affordances and constraints, things that they do better, things that they do a little bit worse. All right? This is kind of the theory that informs the experiment, right? The experiment was, well, what tools should we use? And we kind of did a scattershot approach. We said, well, let's keep this meetup page that we created. Meetup is a local organizing tool for people. They create an event. It gets circulated and spread out to folks in a specific geographic area. If there was somebody else who had been involved in kind of grassroots organizing, Meetup would say, hey, you might be interested in this group too. Right? We've all seen that sort of thing happen on other social networks where they say, you might know this person, you might be interested in this band, etc. Meetup's model is, you might be interested in this group too. They're in your area, they're doing things similar to what you're interested in. Right? We created a Facebook page, and because that's where everybody is, right? Okay, so we created a Facebook page, a Facebook group actually, and we thought that that might be a good place also to reach people who were interested in these topics. But it was experimental in the sense that we were trying to kind of figure out what are the best tools for us to use for our purposes, and we were kind of throwing out a scattershot net to see what worked. We created a Twitter profile as well, and I wasn't super surprised by what things kind of worked well and what things didn't work quite as well, but we definitely learned and kind of validated some assumptions in the process. In terms of locality, reaching people in our specific geographic area, which is the whole logic of this indivisible process, connecting you with people in your community and then using those community connections to exert pressure on your member of Congress. We realized that Meetup was really connecting us to folks that sometimes we didn't have a personal connection with. All right? There'd be someone who didn't know other folks in the group, but still they got an invite. Still they got connected through the Meetup in a way that allowed them to join and become part of the group as well. Facebook, let me talk about inclusivity. You might have noticed in the picture, but then if you look through our group membership page, we have a lot of folks that are a little bit older demographically. All right? It's not the same demographic makeup as we see here on campus, and what I'm learning is that a lot of folks from older demographics might not be on Facebook, might not be on Twitter, but they've got an email address. All right? And Meetup has allowed us to stay in contact with these folks who want to be part of the organization, who want to participate, but are not quite as plugged into social media as some of us might be in this room. Right? So Meetup has allowed us to be a little bit more inclusive of a group by allowing us to reach out to folks just as long as they have an email and they've heard about our group, they join Meetup, and we can communicate with them. Right? Discussion has largely focused in the Facebook realm, and it's not just because Meetup, sorry Meetup folks, but Meetup has a terrible discussion thread tool. Glenn, can you agree? Yeah, it hasn't been good. All right, but Facebook has been really good for discussion. There's kind of an ongoing chat that's happening about topics that people want to bring up within our group. We're up over 100 members in our Mountains community group. Other groups in the 8th District are well up over 150 members. Okay, and Facebook has been a good place for discussion. At the same time, sometimes there's so much discussion that if you're one of the group organizers and you put out a post and it's some sort of important event that you want people to go to or talk about or have some attention to it, sometimes those posts get pushed down the discussion really quick because other people are discussing things too. So there's kind of some tricks and troubles that we've run into in the process. Finally, reach. These two groups, because they're closed groups, you need an invite to join them. To be part of the discussion, to know about what events we've got coming up. They don't have an extraordinary reach, but Twitter is, has been an ideal place for us to kind of communicate well beyond our geographic area, and also to interact with other indivisible groups. This is kind of the place where we get a lot of ideas about what other indivisible groups are up to in their specific localities. All right. But you can see this is the product of some experimentation, though, right? This is us throwing out some tools, trying to use them with some sort of theoretical insight about different social media having different affordances, and then kind of validating and learning about those affordances through the experimental process. That was fun, but things get much more interesting shortly, at least from my perspective. So what have we done as a group? We've been involved in phone banking. So we make calls. Some of them are calls based on the national level indivisible suggestions about what calls would be good to make. At the same time, the national level doesn't have control over each of these individual chapters. We kind of call our own shots in terms of what we want to do, all right, with the basic framework, that guide in place. So we've engaged in phone banking, asking our senators to vote no on specific nominees that the Trump administration has put forward, asking them to engage in specific procedural maneuvers on the Senate floor in terms of how they're going to vote. We've also, increasingly, we've been asking our Congressman Paul Cook to hold a town hall. We were having trouble getting a dialogue going with Congressman Cook, and we had a district work week come up last week, which is basically a recess from Congress where our congressman is supposed to come home and interact with constituents, and we wanted him to hold a town hall. You might have seen on the news there were lots of groups trying to get their congressperson to hold a town hall last week. We were doing the same sort of thing locally. All right? So we did a lot of phone banking, which is facilitated, again, by these tools. Right, on one level or another, whether it's inclusivity, whether it's discussion, et cetera. They're driving toward these sorts of activities. One is phone banking. Another has been direct actions. So January 17th, we went to Congressman Cook's office. We met with a staffer. We expressed our concerns about specific policy issues related to the Trump agenda. The staffer gave us responses, many of which we were not terribly happy with, but we let our voices be known. Later on, we had the executive order on immigration and refugee resettlement. We go back to Congressman Cook's office. We say, hey, we're really unhappy about this. We think this is an unsafe, un-American, and subsequently illegal executive order. And we read a letter to one of his staffers, conveyed that letter, asked for a town hall, and we had about 60 folks at that meeting. Right? At this point, we're really kind of getting frustrated with our lack of response from Congressman Cook, and so we, on February 14th, we held a direct action called Be My Representative, which was obviously a play on the Valentine's Day cards, asking him again to hold a town hall. So we're getting into a little bit of a theme here, right? So the last big sort of, if we've got phone banking, direct actions, and then we were also using these tools to help us have organizational meetings that were more specifically focused on what should we do next, what's up for us, what are we going to engage in. We have used conference calls. We had a postcard party where we got together and had dinner, a couple beers, and wrote postcards to our senators. And more recently, we've been having kind of organized meetings, talking about what are we gonna do next. All right. I know that sounds kind of mundane and boring, but I just want to kind of give you a sense of here are the big three buckets of activities that our group, and I think a lot of these groups, are falling into: phone banking, direct actions, and then sort of organizational or social activities that help the group function and also help the group know each other and establish values and norms. So here's the fun stuff. So having not gotten much response from Congressman Cook's office, and in the lead up to District Work Week, we were basically told that he's not holding a town hall. In fact, we're not going to tell you where he's going to be due to operational security, whatever that means. All right. So we were thinking about how can we, what can we do here now at kind of a crossroads to have an impact that we weren't having an impact with before. All right, and in conversations with other folks who were having similar ideas, other groups were kind of playing around with sarcasm, playing around with satire to try to get their representatives' attention, to get the press's attention. I started thinking back to some lessons that I hear some of you in the audience are reading about right now for your class, which is culture jamming. So culture jamming is a set of activities theoretically informed from communication and media studies that basically uses culture, uses media, appropriates familiar genres, familiar forms of media, and repurposes those to advance the efforts of a particular group. Right? So to give you an example, this is a group called Billboard Liberation Front, and they liberate billboards, is the way that they put it. They go and they take a billboard, and in the middle of the night, they go and appropriate that billboard's messaging, all right, and change the message in a way that communicates something a little bit different to folks driving by on the freeway. So after Wachovia had sent some savings up in flames, they went and communicated that on a Wachovia billboard by just adjusting the message and communicating something a little bit different. They like to say that that Wachovia is one of their clients, that they have more accurately portrayed themselves to the public for. All right. Barbie dolls and G.I. Joe dolls, there was a group called the Barbie Liberation Organization, where they went and they bought the G.I. Joe and Barbie dolls from stores. Turns out, because they're made by the same manufacturer, they have the same voice box in them. And so they switched the voice boxes so that G.I. Joe was saying things like, let's go shopping, and Barbie was saying things like, kill him, and put them back into the boxes, return them to the stores, and parents would buy the dolls for their kids, take them home, find out that they were saying the gender inappropriate thing, and when they went to call the number on the box, they had put the number for the local TV station. All right, so it becomes a media story. All right, and it's not just appropriation. Then it's also tapping into news values. It's tapping into what does the press want to see in a story. Does it have some conflict? Does it have some? Does it have personal characteristics of high-profile people that you might be able to tap into their interest in? All right. News values is kind of a theoretical framework in media studies that says the news is more likely to cover a particular story if it checks off this, 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 and this box. All right. And culture jammers, when they're doing it well, know how to tap into those news values. So they're not just appropriating familiar media forms like the billboard, like the Barbie doll, or familiar cultural forms. They're also doing so in a way that's likely to get subsequent press. Okay? This guy is from a group called the Yes Men. They have a movie called The Yes Men Fix the World. It's awesome. You should absolutely watch it. This is him speaking on BBC World about how Dow Chemicals was going to compensate the victims from a chemical disaster. He does not work for Dow Chemicals. He basically tricked the BBC into having him on their show, and Dow Chemicals lost a ton of money when he told them that they were going to be compensating victims from this chemical spill. But in turn, Dow Chemicals had to explain why they would not be compensating victims. So all of a sudden, this is this really tough situation that ends up publicizing for the public an element of a story that they might not have otherwise got. All right, I'm going to get to the jiu-jitsu element in just a second, but I want to talk about what we did as a culture jam. So this is from a website we created called whereispaulcook.com. And remember, we're having trouble getting him to hold the town hall with us as constituents. So the website says, for weeks, constituents in California's 8th Congressional District have asked Representative Cook to hold a town hall in the Victor Valley during District Work Week to explain his policy positions. District Work Week is a period when legislators are expected to be in their districts interacting with constituents. His repeated failure to schedule a town hall points to one unavoidable conclusion. Congressman Paul Cook is missing. Spread the word and help us find him. So we made up these missing posters. They say elected by California's 8th District in 2013, last in-person town hall in September of 2013, 73 years old, answers to the name Colonel, can be found voting for the Trump agenda 100% of the time. And even he has contested that, but his voting record says otherwise. So you'll also see on the right-hand side, we kind of got into this, all right? On the right-hand side, we've got, you can join a search party, which basically just took you to links to the different indivisible groups in the district. You can print out the missing flyer, which people were posting up on bulletin boards in their communities. Oh, Glenn's got a missing poster there, yeah. We've got an extensive, yeah. We've got an extensive timeline. we've got an extensive timeline that kind of walked folks through, well-researched timeline. It's snarky, it's satirical, but it kind of walks folks through the history that we are trying to highlight and call Congressman Cook to account for. All right, we created our milk carton campaign. This got fun. All right, so we said, hey, if we're going to appropriate, when I'm thinking about the Culture Jam too, the media form or media genre that we're appropriating is the missing person campaign. That's the form, that's the genre. It's got different components though within it that we're using for our messaging, but that's the form, that's the genre. And so we went and we were kind of deciding, should we actually put these stickers on and leave them there and have unsuspecting grocers pick them up and take them home? After checking in with some lawyers, we said, maybe not the best idea. Indivisible National also said that might not be necessary here in terms of the group's image. And so we went and we said, well, let's take some pictures on real milk cartons in a grocery store. Take the pictures, peel the stickers off, circulate the image on social media. I believe the original tweet said, thanks to the California dairy industry for helping with the search for Congressman Paul Cook. So, but it went viral. And we didn't, experimentally, we didn't know that it would go viral. And in terms of reproducibility, this would be, I think, a hard thing to kind of reproduce in another time, although we can use similar models, see how successful it is. This tweet, which was a tweet that someone else created from our tweet, based on what we had shared, got 21,000 likes and 10,000 retweets. This is more attention than Congressman Cook has gotten in a long time, ever. All right, and we were trying to figure out what happened, and we were going back through some of the other retweets. George Takei, all right. If you're not familiar with George Takei, from Star Trek, he's a social media hub. All right, in terms of influence. When George retweets something, it's going to get very visible, very public. He did. As a result, the Rachel Maddow show, I won't show the clip, but she went and put it on her show. She also laughed for a little while afterwards, which, as somebody who watches Rachel's show because she's such a good storyteller, to have made Rachel laugh was so exciting. All right, that was I think it's in terms of experimentally and thinking about different variables, this didn't just happen on its own. This is part of a media narrative that was happening at this time. All these different districts were trying to get their congresspeople to hold a town hall. Some folks weren't showing up, and some people were holding their own town hall and asking their congressman to come. When they didn't show, they would go and ask questions to an empty chair. So there's all this kind of news attention, and I think it's inarguable that we got the level of attention that we did because there was this larger media narrative happening, right? The Google News search results shortly thereafter, I think this was on the 27th. This is Google News search for Congressman Paul Cook, coverage in Mediaite, the Press Enterprise, the High Desert Star, CNN, Victor Valley Daily Press. One of our group leaders was interviewed by the BBC, the LA Times. This got widespread national media attention, again, as part of this larger story of people asking their representatives to hold town halls. One of the most exciting things experimentally was to try and figure out, could we actually get a response out of his office, right? Could we actually prompt them to respond to our frustration about him not holding a town hall and the press coverage that had come to our, especially the milk carton stickers. So this is a quote from his spokesman, Michael Fresquez. I'll just summarize. He basically says, I meet with a lot of people. I'm not going to meet with people who have such a poor political discourse. These folks are a fringe group. These are quotes. Fringe group with a radical political agenda. And they're local agitators. All right. So this was the response. I don't think it's terribly surprising. He was trying to avoid meeting with us in a town hall because of all the attention that the media was giving to other town halls that weren't going very well, especially for Republican representatives. Our group engaged in what culture jammers referred to as a little media jujitsu. So the martial art of jujitsu focuses on how a group responds to the aggression of their counterpart that they're working in relation to. Just as in martial arts and jujitsu, you try to use your opponent's weight against them. So when they attack, you use their weight to put them in a particular hold, for instance. So when he calls us local agitators, our group said, hell yeah. All right. This was a event that, or it's basically an activity that one of our members put together spontaneously. She said, hey, I've seen this charge that we're local agitators with an extreme political agenda. She puts together an event called Notes from the Fringe, which was basically a call for everybody in the group to start putting together notes about why you want Congressman Cook to have a town hall, what political issues are really important to you. They were asked to go ahead and cut the corners to create a fringe effect on the side of the on the side of the paper. But regardless, it was an attempt to challenge this narrative by showing just how reasonable we were about political topics. We're talking about things that aren't crazy, they're not extreme, and this was one of our ways of communicating this to him, but also communicating this publicly. She went and she also penned an open letter to Congressman Cook that was published in the High Desert Star that expressed similar frustration with this characterization. So again, using his weight against us or against him. And lastly, we put together a series of memes that say. And everybody basically was able to put their own information and picture into them. So it says, Congressman Cook calls his constituents who want a town hall local agitators. Melissa Spur is a California 8th District voter who wants affordable health care for all. Damn right, I'm a local agitator. So, kind of drawing attention to this, abuse that had been hurled at her and turning it around and saying, am I so unreasonable, right? And using that in kind of a meme form. So she's somebody who was kind of using that jujitsu part of culture jamming effectively. The Congressman Cook eventually directly responded to our charges, and frankly, he put together a pretty good piece, a pretty good letter in response. If I was one of Congressman Cook's supporters, I'd probably read it and say, well, damn right. All right. At the same time, there are components here that we find really problematic. We think that there are arguments here that don't hold water, and additionally, characterizations of our group that we are in some way violent and a threat to his staff and to his personal safety. All things that we are planning to specifically respond to and address. And again, think about what we've done here. This is a group of everyday citizens that have all of a sudden put themselves in the center of a media debate, right? A press engagement with their congressperson. And the narrative of Paul Cook has shifted from veteran who wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act to somebody who won't talk to his constituents when they want to talk to him, right? So this is a, from our perspective, a really big shift. The Culture Jam kind of had what I think is probably going to be its culminating event last night. I'm a little tired. Spent a lot of work over the past week, but sorry, Jen, my wife's here that I've been, neglecting. Yeah. So we had a candlelight vigil last night for Representative Cook. All right. So we want him to come home. All right. We want him to come back to the 8th District, hold a town hall, et cetera. But we wanted to, again, kind of do this in a way that tapped into those news values, the things that the press would be most interested in, and in a way that would communicate our message very succinctly, very clearly, using an established media or cultural genre, and assuming that the press would cover certain aspects of this compared to your everyday protest. Okay? So we had folks make a shrine that said, come back, Paul, come home, Paul, talk to us, Paul Cook. There was somebody who put, never forget Town Hall 2013, which is the last time he had a town hall. I was going to show this video, and I feel bad not doing so, but for time reasons, I'm not going to. But this is a woman who is directly affected by the Affordable Care Act, has monthly medical costs that are somewhere in the range of $8,000, and has absolutely no idea what she's going to do if a suitable replacement isn't provided. This is one of the things we would like to have a town hall to talk about. I want to just show this clip on the right-hand side there real quick, because this is kind of what the candlelight vigil looked like. Oh yeah, there was music. We made it. We made our own lyrics.
When so many people will die, how can you split all those families apart? How can you heal each heart? How can you listen to messages when water falls?
So we had folks try to count how many people were in that video later in the night, and somewhere around 100, which is our biggest event that we've had yet, which is kind of cool in terms of growth and thinking about the effectiveness of this whole campaign. So I just want to close by thinking about, so what does this mean findings-wise? If you think about findings for experiments, it's usually a set of statistical numbers and p-values and this sort of thing. When I'm thinking about it, we were having findings in terms of visibility. We got a lot of visibility for this campaign. It's done well. We've gotten attention on social media. We've gotten attention in the press. We have effectively shifted the narrative about Congressman Cook and created a new narrative that is the central question of his political exchanges right now, which is he responsive to his constituents? I think we've done a pretty good job with that. Growth-wise, we had a weird problem where the tweet that was produced by someone else in looking at our tweet, he didn't include the link to the website, all right? Didn't include the hashtag. And as a result, we were kind of sitting there going, this is great visibility. George Takei shared this everywhere. Nobody knows how to find our stuff, right? So all that stuff that we created on that website, it clearly didn't get quite the visibility that it might have. And I've been sitting there wondering whether we maybe didn't get quite the growth that we could have as a result. It's a question, but this is what experiments are for, right? In terms of growth for our group, we had our biggest event. Our numbers are growing, but again, kind of wondering to what extent it might have been bigger. Change-wise, we've got this question that kind of lingers, right? This is a group's early efforts, and it's hard to tell what the findings are. Will this change the makeup of our district in terms of representation? Will this change politics more broadly in the United States? The indivisible movement? Hard to say. I want to just leave you with this picture. So this is a adjustment to that previous picture. So I think a lot of folks, when they think of the relationship between thinkers and doers, and if there is a relationship between the two, we usually assume that the thinker influences the doer. I'd like to suggest that experimentally, in terms of community organizing and activism, you can think about the thinker and the doer being the same person, and you can think about the thinker and the doer kind of as a reciprocal process, as an iterative process. We do things, and then as a result, we learn from it. We interpret what happened, and we try and make sense of it, and then from thinking, we go and adjust our activities and do some more. So, thank you all.